All right, guys, here we go. Look, one of the things that I promised you is when we go over something in class, I'm going to explain to you why it's important to know that as a nurse. So one of the things that it's really important. One of the things that I want you to understand is the importance of proteins that are produced by the cells of your body. Now, you should have watched the video on DNA, and you know that DNA is located in the nucleus of the cell. If the cell has a nucleus, it has all the DNA necessary to make every single protein in your body. But watch, not all cells need all the specific proteins that DNA codes for or tells the cell how to make. So what you need to understand is that in order for a cell to do its particular function, it has to have specific proteins. And those proteins are coded for how the cell puts together the amino acids. DNA tells the cell how to do that. And we learned by watching that video, the most important thing about a protein is its shape. Its shape determines its ability to do its particular job. Now, look, if you want to get down to its barest bones in terms of a human being, we are nothing more than a series of chemical reactions that occur inside particular cells. And the proteins that control all the chemical reactions inside your cells are called enzymes. So think of enzymes as like little workers, right? And because different cells perform different functions, they have to perform different chemical reactions. What controls all those chemical reactions inside a particular cell? Enzymes. And what are enzymes made out of? Enzymes are made of protein. And what are proteins made out of? They're amino acids chemically bonded together. And what inside the cell tells the cell how to put together the amino acids is DNA. So let's look at that just for a second, okay? Hang on. Now look, here is a section of DNA. Now DNA is a huge freaking molecule. And we know, because you watched the video, and I'll never forget it, right? DNA is made of these organic compounds called nucleic acids. And we know there are 4 nucleic acids. That's in the video. I'm not going to go over it. Adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine. So when DNA is inside a cell and you're not making proteins, you got to protect that DNA. So to protect it from any potential damage that may enter the nucleus of the cell, it's in the form of a double helix. So this guy right here is an individual nucleic acid. So is this, right? So is this, right? And I'm making this up. I'm going to say that this is adenine, this is guanine, and this is cytosine, and then this guy right here is thymine. Now, if DNA was just a single strand, not a double helix, then it could be damaged really easily. So the body does stuff that makes sense. So to make sure that DNA is not damaged easily, there is this obligatory base pairing that ultimately forms that double helix. So wherever there's an adenine, it's going to pair with a nucleic acid, thymine. And wherever there's guanine, it's going to pair with cytosine. And wherever there's a cytosine, it's going to pair with guanine. And wherever there's a thymine, it's going to pair with adenine. So that's that obligatory base pairing that forms that double helix and keeps it very stable. Now, what I want to point out is this. Remember, DNA, big molecule. And it codes for all the proteins inside the cells of your body. Now, a section of DNA that tells the cell how to put together the particular amino acids and the sequence of those amino acids. And remember, there's 21 individual amino acids. That section of DNA that holds the code to put together a protein is called a gene. And there are 25,000 individual genes, right? Now, watch. This is the important piece. And it was in that video. So look. Are you looking? All right. Watch. The DNA inside the nucleus of your cells tells the cell how to put together the amino acids to make proteins. And there are basically two major classes of proteins, structural, right? That make you up, right? Like the framework of your house, hair, nails, right? And then you have functional proteins. Functional proteins do things. And the big ones are enzymes, and they control all the chemical reactions inside your cell. The other thing, the other type of functional protein are cell receptors. Incredibly important. Can't tell you how important, right? And then hormones. Hormones basically tell the cell to do something. Now, watch. Ultimately, if you look at this, and again, I'm going to try and simplify it. You learned in general, I'll never forget it. It was a Tuesday. That you have different types of cells inside your body, right? And those different types of cells perform different functions. So how do they know? Like, how does a heart cell know to be a heart cell? And a kidney cell to be a kidney cell, or a liver cell to be a liver cell? Well, the answer is this. Different cell types have embedded in their cell membrane these protein receptors. And what's really important for you to know is that the shape of the receptor determines which chemicals from the blood can affect that particular cell. Now, there's a gazillion different types of chemicals floating around in your blood, and you don't want those gazillion different chemicals to affect all your cells equally. It wouldn't make sense. So how do different chemicals in the blood affect different cells? The answer is specific cell receptors embedded in their cell membrane. Now, watch, let's talk about a kidney cell. The reason I want to talk about the kidney cell is my pen was pointing to it, so it's less work for me. Anyways, it has a specific kidney receptor. Now, watch. The DNA of the kidney cell is only going to activate the section of DNA that codes for kidney proteins. How does it know to do that? Well, watch. A chemical from the blood, who cares what it is right now? has a specific shape. And because of the specific shape, this particular chemical can only affect a kidney cell because of its shape. Because of the shape of this particular chemical, it can only bind to this specific receptor in the kidney cell. So it can only affect kidney cells. If this chemical, because of its shape, and then the receptor on a heart cell, this chemical can't affect that particular heart cell. So remember, it is the shape of the receptor, and these receptors are proteins. And what determines the shape of a particular protein is the sequence of amino acids and how they're chemically bonded together. How do you get that sequence of amino acids? How does the cell know to put amino acid 5 first, then amino acid 12, then amino acid 18? The answer is the DNA. And we'll learn more about that as we matriculate through the semester. So this is really important. This is critical. Because different cells do different things, they're going to have different receptors embedded in their cell membrane. And the shape of the receptor will determine which chemicals from the blood can affect that particular cell. Now watch. Let's say, for example, you are a heart cell, and there's a chemical in the blood right there. My pen stopped working. Yeah. There's a chemical in the blood called epinephrine, epi for short. Now, epinephrine is released into the blood in large amounts when you are scared, right? So when epinephrine is released into the blood, it's going to circulate and it's going to bind to a receptor that matches its shape. In this case, it's a heart cell. So when epinephrine or adrenaline, same thing, binds to a particular receptor in a heart cell, it's going to cause your heart rate and blood pressure to go up. So if you've ever been scared, you know your heart races and it feels like your heart's going to pound out of your chest. Your blood pressure goes up. Now, watch. You always have some epinephrine circulating. And epinephrine can increase your heart rate and blood pressure. So let's say, for example, that you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you know, your heart rate's a little high and your blood pressure's high. So I'm going to give you a medicine. And you'll say, okay. And then you'll ambulate home. You'll take the medicine. And what the medicine does is it blocks a specific receptor in heart cells. If it blocks that receptor, then epinephrine can't bind there. And if it doesn't bind there, it can affect that heart cell. What does epinephrine do to your heart rate and blood pressure? It makes it go up. So if you take a medicine that blocks an epinephrine receptor, then that means your heart rate and blood pressure will go down. Those epinephrine receptors have a name. They're called beta receptors. So drugs that are used to prevent epinephrine from the blood binding to a beta receptor are called beta blockers. Now, if you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be giving drugs. And one of the things that you need to know is how these drugs work. And again, there is no drug that covers the heart in a protective coating. It works by affecting individual cells within that heart. And one of the biggest ways that drugs work are by blocking or stimulating specific receptors. That's how they figure out how drugs work. So real smart people with tape between their glasses and pocket protectors figured out the different types of receptors that are embedded in different cells of the body. And they also figured out what chemicals bind to those specific receptors, and then what happens when those chemicals bind to those specific receptors. So in essence, that's pharmacology. So if you don't understand how different cells do different things, you'll never understand pharmacology. And you need to understand that. So remember, the DNA inside the nucleus of a cell contains all the genes necessary to make all the proteins inside every cell of your body. But you don't want all of your cells to make all of the proteins in your body. You want heart cells to make heart proteins, kidney cells to make kidney proteins, and liver cells to make liver proteins, right? How does that cell know to make a specific protein? Because chemicals from the blood will bind to specific receptors on that cell membrane. And the shape of the chemical has to match the shape of the receptor in order for that chemical reaction to occur. So look here. I ripped this off from the internet. Here's a chemical, right? Who cares what it is? When it binds to a specific receptor on the cell membrane, it's going to tell the DNA to activate particular genes that code for specific proteins. And most of the time, when a chemical from the blood binds to a specific receptor and then activates the DNA, a specific gene that codes for a specific protein, that gene codes for enzymes, specific enzymes. And what do enzymes do? They control all the chemical reactions inside your cell. And each enzyme is specific. It does one chemical reaction, and that's it. So if you want a chemical reaction, a specific chemical reaction inside the cells of your body, particular cells of your body, to happen more frequently, then you're going to give them a drug that stimulates that receptor. If you want a particular chemical reaction inside a particular cell not to happen as much, then you will give them a drug that blocks a specific receptor. And that's how pharmacology works. That's why understanding this is important. So if you give somebody a drug that stimulates a receptor, if you stimulate a receptor, that's called an agonist. Agonist stimulate. Remember when you had to read like Shakespeare and stuff in high school? If you give them a medicine that blocks a specific receptor and prevents the enzymes from being formed, that's called an antagonist. Agonist stimulate, antagonist block. All right? So watch. What do we know? Proteins are made of amino acids chemically bonded together. How many amino acids you got? 21 individual amino acids. Where you get those amino acids from? You eat animal and plant protein. So if a cell needs to make a protein, how does the cell know which amino acids to use to make that specific protein? You got it. The DNA. So the DNA, a section of DNA that codes for a specific protein, is called a gene. How does that cell know which portions of the DNA to turn on and make that specific protein? You're not going to believe it, but it's receptors. So when a chemical from the blood binds to a specific receptor, it's going to create a sequence of chemical reactions inside that cell that activates a specific gene within that cell, and it will make a specific protein. So a heart cell don't need to make kidney proteins. It needs to make heart proteins. How does it know to do that? The receptors that are embedded in the cell membrane. And just so you know, there's not just one type of receptor, there's tons of them on each cell. And that's how chemicals from the blood affect different cells differently. And that's how you get specificity in particular cells, by determining which type of receptors are embedded in the cell membrane. Now, please get that. Please. So, watch. Let me explain to you now, and this is incredibly relevant right now. Watch. I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a virus out there that's kind of wreaking havoc. It's called COVID-19. Are you writing that down? Anyways, a virus basically has a little protein coat, and inside that protein coat is a strand of DNA or RNA. And I don't even want to get into it. You'll learn more about that in microbiology. This is what I want you to understand. Okay? And what does DNA code for? I don't care if you're a virus or a human or a ferret. DNA codes for proteins. And the DNA of the COVID-19 virus, that DNA codes for these spike proteins that are embedded in the protein code of that virus. Now watch. The shape of the protein is determined by the sequence of amino acids that make up that protein. Where did the COVID-19 virus get the information needed to string together the amino acids to make the spike protein? Yep, you got it. The DNA inside that virus. Now, the virus can only affect cells of the body that have a receptor on it that matches the shape of that spike protein. And when it binds to that specific COVID spike protein receptor, when the spike proteins bind to that specific receptor, it takes up the virus, and then basically what the virus does is it takes your cells hostage, and it says, look, a heart cell, you ain't gonna do heart stuff no more. You're gonna become a viral production factory for me. And then you're gonna make more COVID-19 virus and you're gonna send it out into the blood and it's gonna circulate to other cells and affect other cells. Kidney cells, if they got that specific spike protein receptor, then you go into kidney failure. And all viruses work the same. So remember, it's the shape of the protein, the spike protein, on the surface of the COVID-19 virus that determines which cells it can affect. Because if that particular cell has a receptor embedded in its membrane that matches the shape of the spike protein, that virus is taken up into that cell and your cells no longer do what they're supposed to do. So, what do? Well, hopefully you didn't get it and you got a vaccine. Now look, your body, your immune system doesn't know the difference between somebody hacking a loogie on you and then you sucking in the COVID-19 virus or going to Walgreens and getting a vaccine. The response is the same. But the important thing to know is that if you're vaccinated, and how it basically works, it's very simple, is this mRNA vaccine builds these spike proteins. It has the same genetic code as the COVID-19. So it's going to make these spike proteins, and then your immune system is going to say, hey, I don't recognize these spike proteins. This ain't me. It's something foreign. It's a foreign antigen. So your immune system is going to begin to build these specific proteins called antibodies. And what the antibodies do that are formed is they will bind to the spike proteins on the COVID-19 virus. And when they bind, it changes the shape of this spike protein and it prevents the spike protein from binding to a receptor on a cell. And if you can prevent the COVID-19 spike protein from binding to a specific receptor on a cell, it can't infect the cell. That's how all vaccines work. Now watch. If you are exposed to the actual COVID-19 virus, you don't have these antibodies formed, and it can take 2 to 3 weeks for your immune system to kick in and start building those antibodies. But in the meantime, that COVID virus infects your cells and you get sick. That's why knowing this stuff is helpful. It helps you understand it because people will ask you questions. Now watch. Why is this Delta variant of such concern? Well, because the DNA of the COVID-19 virus, if the DNA is mutated, meaning the sequence of nucleic acids within that DNA of that COVID-19 virus are changed, right? That ATCG sequence is changed. Then when the COVID-19 virus makes the spike proteins, those spike proteins will be of a different shape. And if they're of a different shape, the antibodies that you have already formed, if you got the vaccine, will no longer recognize it because the antibodies that are formed are specific for the shape of those specific spike proteins. That's why the COVID-19 Delta variant is of concern. Because watch, if you get a vaccine and you destroy the virus before it infects your cells, then it can't mutate. That's why getting a vaccine is critical. And the more people that go unvaccinated, the more likely that COVID-19 virus, the DNA within it, is going to mutate and change the shape of those spike proteins to the point where the antibodies will no longer be able to recognize it and destroy it, and you gonna get sick. So that's why it's important, right? And that's why clinically it's important that you understand this. I hope it helped. I hope this recorded too. All right. All right, be good. Study, okay?